you've never seen this
And
before.
what would you
But
think
are you
that
not
Felix
allowed to
González
actually-
Torres would think about that?
Well, I mean, I can't do that job. I don't communicate
is there,
with the dead.
is there somewhere, I say score, is there somewhere a window that allows that?
Yes.
You're sure?
Such a show
Because
is only possible because his work, every work of his has a certificate, and the certificate announces that it's the responsibility of the owner, the person installing it, the institution, the curator, to decide what form it should take. And that's also motivating this exhibition.
Yeah,
but
then you come into I have the experience with Alan Capro, where you have scores, and in the end of his life, Alan Capro allowed artists to interpret the scores of his environments and his happenings, and in the end, I was co-curating a touring exhibition. And when it arrived in Los Angeles, there was a big row because, in fact, most of the artists that were invited to interpret scores kidnapped Capro's work to make an Alan Ruppersberg, a Paul McCarthy, etc., etc., etc. And it didn't have anything to do with Capro anymore. So where is the kind of like, how do you say it? Where is the limit? Where is the bridge? Where does it go astray in the wrong way? How would you intervene?
I think it's an interesting question, but I think it's based on a fundamental misconception, which is, why does no one expect that I'm kidnapping the work? You know, they expect that the artist might, but actually every single exhibition, no matter who it's done by, is a question of personal taste, of subjectivity, non-neutrality. So every time
what is
there's
your stance? It's just an informative question. What is your stance on a situation that Buren criticizes, again, back to the text of Buren, but where Eric Troncy put Bernard Buffet paintings on Solhuit wall drawings? Exactly. I saw an exhibition which I did the same reaction, and it was also a curator where Elke Christofek was allowed to paint menstruation underneath on Cawaras. That type of things. And that's what I'm...
What's wrong with that, exactly?
Well, I will ask you, what is wrong with that?
No, when Count Panza di Biomo, you know, who has a very beautiful, very early Solevi drawing in his barn, kind of decided to go back to farming or whatever and started using the barn for what barns are normally used to. It made the Solevi look even better. Fantastic now. It's all the rates kind of thing. No, it's true. Go there. It's fantastic.
But it's still different. It's not the same as hanging a Bernard Buffet painting on... It's still something else.
You know, maybe Bernard Buffet painting is not a fair match to rake or Pharaohs or something, but...
Well, with your example of the barn,
I think actually there is you know, I'm listening and I'm beginning to kind of see the light a little bit. Sometimes when we really want a theory, the best advice is to look at the kind of semiotics and semiology, to really examine the words we use. So we started with this kind of language of sexuology or something, withdrawal, you know, it was in, let's pull it out, you know. We could just as well talk about kind of premature participation, for instance, you know. Use this weird sort of language which
well, let's
no,
move
hang on a minute. Let me finish the point on the language. And it seems to me that in kind of using somehow, it's not that we are wrong. We are describing things that we sort of understand in the right context. We know what we are talking about, but we are somehow trying to load the language in a certain way. And it seems to me that we are demanding, the keyword here will be the quasi-artist that you use, Elena. The curator as the, why quasi-artist? You know, why not the artist as the quasi-curator, for instance? You know, it's a weird thing. And the way we load the language seems to me is as a kind of desperate call for having some role other than the role we have. You know, it's like if we were jealous that when an emergency occurs on a flight, there is everybody calling, is there a doctor around? Nobody ever calls, is there an artist around? You know,
Why would
an aesthetic emergency is this is a very ugly thing here. Is there a doctor? Is there an artist around? It seems to me that we are calling for some kind of slice of a role which is not quite ours.
well,
Whereas we should be talking about what we do within our roles.
well, I want to move to Tanya because this is
alright.
a fantastic bridge. Tanya advanced the idea of useful art.
That's the point. Yeah.
Yes, but I would love to have Tanya talk about two recent projects. Well, one is less recent, but as an artist, taking the risk to almost leave art, and you say, I'm not even interested anymore if it's called art or if it's art or not. In my recent practice, we are exactly. I'll come back to you later. You can bring the definition in semiotic
Premature.
orthodoxy. But I would love you to talk about once the school, the cathedra,
Okay.
but secondly, and probably more, I think more people are informed about the school, but secondly about this immigrant movement, in which you also advanced the idea, trying to formulate as a word useful art. What does it mean? What does it mean for you? It has this kind of like very broad expectations. It can be interpreted for many, but I think it's very specific.
It is. Well, and okay. I think I also want to, in my answer, touch some points that were saying before. I have never withdrawn from everything for anything, and the reason is that I think withdrawing or saying no to something comes out of a position of privilege. And in my career as an artist, I had, as you were doing too, to use all means possible. Not to get famous or to get money, because I don't have either, but just to gain political power in certain other conditions away from those biennales, because I'm also a biennale kid, so...
Biennale kid?
Yeah. Artist. So every time I was invited to Venice, or every time I was invited to Johannesburg, that immediately translated into I have more power in Cuba to do more transgressive things. So I didn't care about the Biennale itself. Of course, I cared to look good, and of course, normally. But for me, it was more important, more tactically say, okay, if I say yes to Documenta, because of that, I could do the art school in Cuba. Because I came back to Cuba, and everybody was like, what do you want, So it was not about Documenta itself. It was
So you use like Documenta or a biennial as a vehicle for something else.
Yeah.
What is left then at Documenta and the biennial?
What is left one?
What is left at the Documenta?
Well,
for
of
example?
course, you have to live the moment. So when you are there, you have to do the best you can, and put your position as well. But the overall, I mean, there are two times in your position. One is the here and now, and one is what you do with that later. So the here and now, I tried to also have a discourse and conversation with the biennial, but the later, for me, is more important, And what happened basically is I came back to Cuba, and I was expelled I was professor at the art school in Cuba, at University of Art, and I was expelled because the director was suspicious of the text that was coming. There was too much discussion in the room and blah, blah. He started coming to see my classes very often. I say, why do we have to have an exam of my teaching every week? I don't get it. So basically, I used that to come back and from the inside bombarded the institution. That, So I think I'm more interested, instead of saying no, which is a more instead of saying no is to say yes, but then you have to deal with me on my terms. So it is an educational process with the institution, because I think the institution has learned too quickly how to respond to the no's. And I prefer to force the institution within itself, inside. That's my technology, my tactic, I don't know.
So the Cattedra Arte de Conducta is not a completely independent project. It is
It was
part
not,
of a
It was a project within the project of the ISA, which is Instituto Superior de Arte. And they call me to teach, and I say, the only way I'll teach if I have my own department. I say, okay, I just came from Documenta, I can say whatever. So, and they say, okay, I say, good. And then, of course, I tried to gain independency because they could not pay me, they have no money. I say, fine, good, independence economically. They cannot pay any professor, and they did have no space because the school was under renovation, and, and I don't really know how much they really want me there, to be honest. It was kind of like...
Doesn't sound very
Yeah.
committed.
Yeah, I know. And the funny part is, like I say, perfect, because I always wanted to do the project in my own house, in my own, outside. So I say, great. So I did it in my house. It's very far from the school. It's very hard for these people to come and look what I'm doing. So it was perfect.
So I'm sorry,
Yeah.
what did they give you then? If you get no.
The only thing they gave me was the institutional umbrella, because in Cuba it's legally forbidden to meet more than certain amount
legally
of
forbidden
people.
to meet.
Yes, yeah, you cannot meet certain amount of people in places. You cannot sit down and meet, because this is something they don't want.
Okay. So you don't have beers, you don't do this and that, but when you make a school, you can meet.
Yes. So basically, my original idea was a criticism of the art world in Cuba, because after the year 2000, a lot of artists understood the Biennale was also a way for having foreigner market coming in, and I didn't like the way in which they were talking about politics as made for the occasional political tourist.